Everyone, welcome to our new session, which is CISA Domain 5. Okay. And previously, we had already covered CISA Domain 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the very holistic view. And if you guys want to take a reference on what is Domain 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can always go back to my previous videos. So, today we'll talk about the domain 5 of the CISA certification program. Okay, so this domain is titled Protection of Information Assets, and it focuses on ensuring that an organization's informations, systems, and infrastructures are safeguarded against the unauthorized access, misuse, disclosures, alterations, and destructions. In the previous domain, the emphasis was more on governance, acquisition, development, and operations. But domain 5 moves from planning and management into actual enforcement and production. So, this is the domain where IS auditor evaluates whether the controls are real, operational, measurable, and effective, and not just written on a paper or a policy to uh, set up the bar. Not just on the paper. It should be implemented and is able to, mm, and we as an auditor are able to measure whatever is written in the policies. Okay. So the objective of this domain is very simple. It is to ensure that only authorized individuals have access to information and their access is appropriate, and that all access is traceable to a responsible individual. Because now let's say we in an organization there are certain data, or let's say an asset. Definitely data is an asset, so we'll consider that. And we don't have any owner for that data. So who will be accountable if there's a loss or someone had access those data? So without a responsible individual, it is very difficult to trace the access. So this domain examines how well the organization understand its information assets and how effectively it prevents unauthorized access to them. Okay, so definition of information asset. So in CISA language, the information assets includes any resource that stores, process, or transmits information. Okay. Information assets are more than just the databases or the servers. Okay, they also includes laptops, mobile phones, emails, printed documents, cloud storage, and even the backup tapes. And a mature organization maintains a complete list of those information assets, referred to as an asset inventory, because an asset that is not identified cannot be protected and also cannot be classified. And if it's not classified, definitely we can't protect those assets. So why does inventory matters? Okay, many incidents happen because of not the attacker is highly skilled, but because of organization does not know where its information resides. So just for an example, a development team may copy production data into the test environment, okay, without masking any sensitive information. So this is again a kind of a risk. Or let's say another example, a database backup file could be emailed to an external consultant without an encryption. So in those scenarios, it poses a bit of a, not a bit of, but a huge risk if the data is very confidential and it's not encrypted, and in case if the network is being traced or man in the middle attack is happening, it means that the information is into a wrong hand, and as an attacker they can take the information or they can tamper the or modify the informations as well. Okay, so this situation occurs when organization do not have a working inventory or where ownership is unclear. Okay, so as an IAS auditor, we will begin by requesting proof that all the information assets are inventory. So the inventory should include details such as asset name, type, location, owner, and the data classification. Then comes the ownership and the accountability. Every asset must have a designated owner. CISA makes a clear distinction. The data owner decides who may access the data. The data custodian facilitates the technical implementation, and the user is the authorized consumer of the information. Makes sense? Then ownership equals accountability. So if you are a owner of that data and anything happened to that data, you as a owner will be accountable because the data is under your scope, and you should make sure that the data is classified accordingly, and also for the private data or the company sensitive data there are the relevant controls in place to protect them. Okay, if no one owns the data, no one is accountable for protecting it. So that's a basic principle why we have ownership for the data and why the owners are the accountable person for that data. So during an audit, one of the first question which is asked is who approved access to this data. This is again to determine who is the owner of that data. And if the organization cannot prove ownership approval, the control is considered as ineffective. Okay, moving on to our next slide, which is data classification. So why do we need to classify the data? So if we are not classifying the data, it means that we are unaware of what data needs to be at a what level of protection. Okay, so if definitely as an organization there will be terabytes of data within the organization, and we can't enforce the same technology for all the data. As we know, our goal is to protect the data, but we should also consider which data needs which level of protection. So if there's so basically the data is classified into public data, internal data, confidential data, and highly sensitive or regulated data. So now if we don't know which data is classified under which category, it means that we are going to implement the same control over all the data, and this will again include the cost and increase the budget. So for your understanding, public data are the data for which the disclosure has no negative impact. Okay. Then comes the internal data, which is used within the organizations only. Confidential data are those data whose disclosure could cause financial or operational loss. Highly sensitive or unregulated or my bad, regulated data, if disclosed, could cause legal penalties or reputational damages. So the organization should define handling rules for each classification, including retention, encryption, transmission rules, and destruction requirements. So in this scenario, the IS auditor evaluates whether the data classification is applied consistently and whether the handling rules are actively enforced. Moving on to our next slide, which is data lifecycle protection. So now we have classified the data. Now comes the data lifecycle protection. So information protection is not limited to storage. It must extend across the entire data lifecycle, starting from creation or acquisition of the data to storage and retention to processing and usage, sharing or transmission, archival, and disposal or destruction of the data. So the IS auditor examines whether the controls follow the data at every stage. Let's say for an example, just an example to share. So if sensitive data is sent to a third party, the auditor verifies whether the contractual data protection clauses were executed or not. Now moving on to our next slide. Before that, make sure that an organization is classifying the data, and you as an auditor needs to make sure that the data is being classified systematically over each stages. Okay, and every stage is being supported by certain controls, and those controls are consistent. So once the asset has been identified, classified, and assigned an owner, the next priority is controlling who has access and how that access is being granted. So this section focuses on identity and access management, and it is the most tested topic in domain 5 and the foundation of the protecting information assets. Okay. So now an introduction to IAM in identity and access management. So the ultimate purpose of IAM is to ensure that every user accessing information is properly authenticated, properly authorized, and fully accountable for their activity. So the access must be logical, traceable, and revocable. Domain 5 expects the organization to demonstrate this through evidence that access is granted based on business needs and not just based on the convenience. Okay. So what IAM questions? Okay. So IAM questions who has access and why. So in CISA auditing, the most important question related to access is very simple. Who gave this person access and what business justification supports it? If there is no justification, it means that the control is ineffective. Okay. So organization often fails not because access exists, but because the business did not approve it, the access were never reviewed, and more critically, access was never removed. Just think of a scenario where an employee had left the organization and his access to the data is not being removed, as the organization had not reviewed, or the team had not reviewed the access, and even after the termination of an employment, he is able to access the data of an organization. Just think at what level he can go if we have the data of the organization. So this is a very big failing point for an organization. So IAM ensures that authorization decisions are intentional and controls. So this IAM operates on joiner, mover, and lever lifecycle. So a joiner would be or is a new hire who requires system access to perform their role. Mover is an employee who changes roles and whose access must be modified accordingly. And a leaver is a departing employee whose access must be removed immediately. Okay. So during an audit, the highest risk category is the leaver. As we discussed earlier about the scenario that if a person is being terminated from an organization and if he is still having access to the data, what level he can go. Okay. Or maybe he won't do anything, but at the worst case it will be a very worst scenario for an organization if a leaver is trying to access those data which is intended to be within an organization. Okay. So during an audit, the highest risk category is the leaver, and if a former employee retain access even for few hours, the organization is vulnerable. So when an auditor evaluates access controls, the most common audit test is that they obtain a list of terminated employees for the past 3 months, compare termination dates to system access removal records, and also identify accounts that remained active beyond acceptable time frame. So inactive accounts are especially abandoned accounts. Privileged accounts represents one of the highest risk findings. Okay, moving on to our next slide, which is access provisioning and approval. So access must never be granted without business approval. The owner, which are basically non-IT, must approve the access. So in a mature environment, this approval process is automated through a workflow system. Just for an example, uh, a company would be having a no let's say a service now ticket they would be having, and where the person who needs the access will raise a ticket and the business owner will give the justification within that ticket, and those workflow is developed, so the notification will go to the person who is taking care of an IAM, and he will go through the ticket, he'll go through the justification, and if that justification feels valid, they will approve the access. And in a weaker environment, the approval may happen by an email. This is still fine, and in some cases even verbal approval is given, which is unacceptable in the audit terms. So access approvals must be documented, traceable, and linked to identity records. The IS auditor reviews a sample of access requests and verifies whether approval were obtained before provision. If access exists without documentation, the control is ineffective regardless of the technology. An organization is using a very high technology, they are investing a lot within the technology, but in case if those technology is not, in case if the policy is not being followed for a provisioning, it is totally a waste for a technology to have in an organization. So auditor makes sure that if there's a process, the process is being followed. Now moving to our next slide, which is authentication. So what is authentication? So authentication is in the place to ensure that an identity is legitimate. So common authentication methods include basically three principles within authentication, which is something the user knows, something the user has, and something the user is. Something the user knows is a password. Something the user has can be a token or a mobile authenticator, and something the user is a biometric. Okay. Then multi-factor authentication adds strength by combining at least two categories. CISA evaluates whether system uses multi-factor authentication for remote access, administrative access, and access to the sensitive data. An auditor will request proof of MFA enforcement if MFA exists only in policy but is not enforced technically. The control fails. Okay. Moving on to our next slide. So, why authorization is required? So, authorization ensures that the user receives only the minimum level of access necessary to perform their job functions. So, this security principle is also called as least privilege. Organizations use role-based access control (RBAC) to enforce least privilege. In RBAC, access is tied to the job role and not the user. So within a system, every job role will be tagged with the level of access, and once employee is on board and given that job role, the access for him will be provisioned automatically for his role. Okay. And in an audit, the RBAC is effective when employee in the same role have the same access, and changing the employee's role automatically changes their access level. So if access is granted individually and manually instead of role based, privilege creep occurs. So privilege creep leads to users accumulating permissions over time, which creates undiscoverable risk. Okay. So moving on to our next topic, which is access recertification. So to maintain control over access, periodic access reviews must occur. This is called access recertification. The data owner receives the list of active users and verifies whether each user still requires access or not. So this is not a technical validation, it is a more of a business validation. The IS auditor checks for the frequency of access reviews, whether the owner actually confirms the access, and whether access was removed for users who no longer requires it. So if recertification is performed by IT instead of data owner, the control fails, because as we discussed previously, data owner are the person who owns the data and are accountable for the fact who is having the access to that data. Okay, and they would be the person who would be actually making sure that the relevant people is having a relevant access to that, to their data. Then we'll be transitioning into the privileged access. So far the discussion has been about the regular access, and now we are going to transition to the highest risk type of access, which is privileged access, the access that can modify system data, logs, or security controls. So Privileged access management. Privileged access includes administrator accounts, root access, database administrator accounts, firewall access, cloud admin access, and the domain controllers. So privileged access must not be the permanent. Okay. Instead, it should be granted in a temporary basis when needed and removed immediately when the task is completed. Okay. So best practice is the use of a PAM vault. Privilege accounts are checked out like a library book. Justification must be enforced before use, and the password rotates automatically after check-in, and all actions are logged and monitored. So the auditor reviews a sample of privileged sessions and verify whether each sessions correspond to an approved request. Okay. Then next topic is session monitoring and accountability. Privileged activity must be monitored. So this includes database administration actions, cloud console changes, firewall modification, user creation and deletion. Monitoring provides accountability. If an administrator uses shared credentials and the organization cannot determine which individual performed an action, accountability is lost. So in audit terms, shared privileged account represents a high severity audit findings. And for a fact, or as a best practices, the privileged account must not have the multiple owners. It should tag to a single member, for which if something goes wrong, he would be the accountable person and will be able to determine who had done wrong. Okay, and its accountability. Moving on to our next phase, or the next section. So in this section we established that the access must be intentional, justified, approved by the data owner, traceable and revocable. Identity is not just authentication, it's accountability. And in the next part we'll cover protection techniques such as encryption, tokenization, masking, DLP enforcement, monitoring, incident response, and forensics evidence handling. Okay. So we'll now cover encryption. Before that, after defining access and identity control, the next responsibility is to ensure that the information remains protected regardless of where it is stored or who attempts to access it. Information protection focuses on three goals: keeping information confidential, preserving the integrity of the information, and ensuring that information remains available when required. So the protective measure used in modern organization rely on encryption, data masking, tokenization, logging, monitoring, and evidence generation. Coming to our topic, encryption. Encryption prevents information from being readable even if the system storing it is compromised. So encryption focuses on the confidentiality of the data. So there are two major forms of encryption. First is encryption at rest, which applies to the stored information, databases, drivers, cloud storage, and backups. And encryption in transit, which protects the information while it moves or while it travels within the network. Such examples would be emails, APIs, file transfers, VPN traffic. So as an IS auditor, we'll verify three things. First is encryption is not optional, it is implemented by default. Encryption keys are stored securely, usually in a key management server or hardware security module. Then key management is controlled by someone other than the system administrator to preserve the segregation of duties principles. Okay, so encryption is only as strong as the control around key access. Okay, if someone can access the encryption keys, they can decrypt anything and everything. Okay, moving to our next topic, which is data masking and tokenization. Data masking hides sensitive information in lower environments like development or testing. Production data must never be copied into non-production environment without masking or tokenization. Masking replaces values with fake equivalents, while tokenization replaces sensitive data with a reversible token. Tokenization is commonly used in PCI environment to protect the credit card information, and it is one of the most crucial control within the PCI DSS compliance. Okay, so during an audit, one of the simplest tests performed by the IS auditor is show me a test environment database and let's search for sensitive information. If sensitive values exist in non-prod environment, the masking control has failed. Okay, moving to our next topic, which is data loss prevention, abbreviated as DLP. So, data loss prevention system monitor and prevent unauthorized movement of information. DLP enforces the rule defined by the classification. It can block email that contain sensitive data, alert when files are uploaded to personal cloud drives, block USB transfer, detect large outbound data transfer. The auditor will request evidence that DLP alerts are reviewed and closed properly. If alerts are generated but not monitored, the controls is considered ineffective. Then moving to our next topic, which is logging and monitoring. So logging establishes accountability by recording activities. Monitoring assesses those logs to detect abnormal or unauthorized behavior. A mature logging environment includes log of authentication events, privilege activity logs, data access logs, configuration changes, security policy changes. And logs must be retained and protected from modification. The IS auditor reviews SIEM records and verifies whether the events are being ingested into the monitoring system. Alerts are created for suspicious behavior. Alerts are reviewed, investigated, and closed. Logs proves accountability, while monitoring proves control effectiveness. Then SOC and incident management. So SOC is termed as a security operations center. Logs alone does not do anything if no one is reviewing them. Okay. So a security operations center monitors events and determines whether a security incident is occurring. The SOC operates based on playbooks and standard operating procedures. Each alert results in an incident ticket, and that ticket must show when the alert occurred. Basically, the log should include the timestamp, who handled it, who within a SOC handled those incident. Basically, who as a SOC analyst who had handled that incident, what was done, what was the action item that SOC analyst had done for that ticket, and whether the remediation was successful or not. So the IS auditor requests a sample of closed incidents and inspects the entire life cycle: alert, investigation, escalation, and resolution. In some cases, the auditor also follows evidence whether the SLA is being followed or not for closing out the incident. If not, this is again the control ineffectiveness. Moving on to our next topic, which is vendor risk management or third party access. When data is shared with external parties, risk does not get transferred. The responsibility remains with the organization itself. So, third party risk evaluation includes performing due diligence before granting access, then reviewing a SOC 2 or ISO certification, or any kind of a security white paper privacy policy to make sure that the vendor is also treating security as a priority and not just for the sake of business. Then ensuring contract clauses such as breach notification and right to audit are in place. So breach notification states that when the vendor is being breached from the attacker or compromised by the attacker, they should immediately contact their uh, client and inform them that they have been breached so that their client can uh, enforce security controls to make sure that they are not getting affected with that breach. And also the right to audit, which says that a client can at any time can audit their system to make sure that the vendor is following the best security practices and are moving forward towards closing out the risk findings and uh, having their own risk appetite, and they are accepting risk which are below their appetite. Okay, then during the evaluation we also, as an auditor, during the evaluation an organization also checks that uh, requirement for the data deletion or return at the contract termination. So what uh, this means is that during the evaluation we also check that how after our contract is being terminated from that vendor they are going to treat our data. So whether they are going to delete it or uh, how they are going to delete it or how they are going to return it. Okay, so if a vendor has access to the sensitive data, they must follow the same security rules that internal user follows. Moving to the next one, which is cloud security and shared responsibility. So in the cloud, responsibility is shared. So security is being shared between both cloud provider and the cloud uh, provisioner or the cloud user. Okay, so the cloud provider is responsible for physical security, underlying hardware, and the hypervisor, and as a customer remains responsible for IAM configuration, data encryption, monitoring. So misconfigured cloud storage is the number one reason for the cloud data leaks. The IS auditor confirms whether cloud environment are configured according to security baselines and whether logging captures cloud configuration changes or not. Okay. Moving on to our next topic, incident response and forensics. So when a security incident occurs, the objective is to contain the incident, prevent the damage, and preserve the evidence. Incident response documentation must include the nature of the incident, actions taken, decisions made, and time of containment and recovery. Forensic evidence must be collected in a way that maintains chain of custody, meaning that evidence never leaves control without record of who handled it and when. And if chain of custody is broken, evidence becomes legally invalid. So we are done with the topics, and at this point, domain 5 can be summarized into three core responsibilities: protect information from unauthorized access, ensure that access is justified, approved, and revocable, and produce evidence that control is functioning. And in the CISA exam, make sure the correct answer is usually the one that demonstrates control effectiveness, enforces accountability, and produces auditable evidence. Domain 5 does not ask whether a control exists, it asks whether the control is effective, monitored, and traceable. So, if the auditor cannot obtain evidence, the control does not exist. So, this is the end of our CISA Domain 5 as well. Hope you guys like the video. Moving forward, we'll be coming out with the Q&A sessions for each and every domain separately. So stay tuned. If the video was useful to you guys, hit a like and subscribe to the channel for further content. And stay safe, stay secure. Thanks for your time. Good day.